The last subject of this semester is the visibility of the women translators. To be or not to be visible. Lawrence Venuti criticizes the idea of the translator as invisible and of a good translation as fluent, transparent, and easy to read. A translation can be read as a text in its own right. Translators have always been invisible presences in the target text, shadows echoing the author's words, but as echoes, they work as reflection and sound different. In this way, they are visible. Translation is a form of passive aggression. In doing it, a writer chooses to forego original authorship so as to play havoc with a foreign original in a process of imitation, zigzagging between the foreign and the receiving languages, but in the last analysis, cancelling the first in favor of the second, according to Lawrence Venuti. Discussing the notion of otherness in translation, Susan Bassnett refers to the confrontation with unfamiliar concepts and forms and affirms that translators negotiate the relationship between the known and the alien, the self and the other. Otherness is reconceptualized as something that can be negotiated in a contact zone and in between space. As Louise von Flotow stresses, the group of English-French women writing and translating each other in Canada in 1980s made clearly visible the issue of bilingualism and the feminist agenda. Today, women translators and theorists are promoting a practice of feminist translation that can be seen as a set of principles guiding translation process. Focusing on the idea of identity and gender as retraceable social constructions in language, they outline the specificity of female authority. It is a clear ideological position which emphasizes the importance of the translator's visibility and agency. Translation is not a carrying across, but a reworking of meaning, the continuation of the creation of meaning. Louise von Flotow has underlined the importance of pretextual elements as means of deconstructing and reappropriating the text. The feminist translator can use devices such as supplementing, her own notion of compensation, prefacing, footnoting, which draw attention to the translation process and the translator's choices, and hijacking the appropriation of a text not overtly feminist, where the feminine is made visible through language. Feminist translators use language as cultural intervention. They alter expressions and metaphors of gender bias and domination at the level of concepts, of syntax, and of lexicon. The translator is not free to do whatever she wants. Her work is shaped and focused by agency and visibility. This recognition provides an essential critical perspective on translations as products of the ideological tensions of given times and allows us to make cultural sense of the difference between the original and its translation. Through the deconstruction of the gendered images of dominance, betrayal, and fidelity, these scholars outline how faithfulness is to be directed towards the writing project in which both author and the translator participate. As Jose Santamia has well summarized it, a translator creates but copies or rewrites, reproduces faithfully but has scope for intervention, aims at equivalence but ends up producing difference. It is the text manipulation by the feminist translator that lets language speak for women. The correction of the text is carried on its name of feminist truths, which aim at the deconstruction of archetypal feminine images and gendered discourses. However, an overt interventionism in the act of translation is controversial because to what extent the translator's role become overtly political and which are the borders not to overcome to maintain the faithfulness, equivalence in difference. To whom and to what is the translation to declare fidelity? Moreover, should fidelity be considered as a movement in synchrony with writing, as if writer and translator were one? Is the visible-invisible dichotomy useful for gender-conscious translators? And finally, if fidelity comes from an interchange between author and translator, how can we translate texts which are not particularly or overtly feminist as the one we prefer to? Kate Clancy is a contemporary Scottish poet. She is the author of two prize-winning collections of poetry, Slattern and Samarkand, and one of a wonderful collection poems on motherhood, Newborn, published in 2004, which is the case of study of this research. As you can see, the book called Newborn, written by her. The subject of Newborn is a challenging one dealing with feminist translation. The poet centers on motherhood and portrays the transformations of female body without idealizing the subject. On the contrary, she presents these themes from a very realistic perspective. Clancy seems to take the act of writing about motherhood a step further. She continues exploration of its hidden, or at least not discussed, aspects. Deconstructing the taboos about the maternal bodies, the poet puts on the page the complexities of birth, its pain and difficulties. In doing so, she intends to rewrite and to complicate the backlash script on motherhood. The main themes of her poems: birth, motherhood, family, and love. Her poetry is an act of self-representation that sounds choral, as if any woman could recognize similar experiences. As the poet states, "My gender is central to the way I write and important to the way I read." The chosen subject and the language used to talk about it creates a strong empathy with the woman reader, and her work seems to be very interesting material to translate from a feminist perspective. The poet utilizes figurative elements that include anything that can be directly registered by one of the five senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch, in order to portray her own perception of outer world. It is depicted as a revolution, a loss, an explosion of the senses, a mechanism of bodily changes, a process of new gestures and thoughts. Newborn charts the month of pregnancy, the drive to hospital, the birth and the first encounter with the baby, the son's learning to walk and to speak. We can say that a strong language is used, love, relationship, intensely essential, and outspoken style are preferred. Motherhood is a choice you make every day to put someone else's happiness and well-being ahead of your own, to teach the hard lessons, to do the right thing, even when you are not sure what the right thing is, and to forgive yourself over and over again for doing everything wrong. The main topic and a sample page from the book taken is here. Is this a new example of feminine signature? Or is it merely a celebration of femininity? Is it a new écriture féminine, this is a French word, where feminine sexuality and the world are discovered through the color of a woman's life, images, sounds, and smell? Can this be considered as a fluid writing? In a way it is. A poetry often allows texts to be, but Clancy goes ahead with feminist writing, an experimental language, experimenting the crafting of words in a very different way. The themes around the same category, motherhood, proliferate, while her stylistic choice is not a common one. In this way, the reader's expectancy with regard to the subject is not fulfilled. He discovers a different way of dealing with the maternal body and thoughts. The translator also has not, and for the translator, this is not an easy task as well. The coherence of the text is carried on through repetition, a semantic consistency which is quite complicated to translate into another language. Here's another sample page from her poems. I had my eyes shut the whole time, and in that inner cinema saw the rushed vermilion curtains rise on a vast screen showing lava. There you issued forth in scarlet flumes, in a cinescope, in a sunrise of a burst veins. This being a very feminine subject and the poet's style being a direct and frank feminine voice, it's a challenging task to translate bearing a feminist approach in mind. If the feminist translator, as we have seen, works hand in hand with the author, how can these poems be translated? Here the main task of the translator is to rewrite the poetry full of multiple utopias woven with the masterly craft-like. For example, in the poem What Can I Say?, where the poet utilizes smileys in order to portray the very moment of delivery. The mother's body and the act of childbirth are compared to Japanese tricks: cellophane, fish, sheet coil of sand, fishing nets, mainsails, a parachute, and stuck together with the choice of verbs of movement, uncurl, twitch, shoot out, unfold, timple, spool, bloom that recall a very fast action. The Italian translation keeps the idea of a fast, unexpected movement visualized in a material acts. The translation from English into Italian functions very well as a fruitful interchange between the author and the translator, two women whose voices are both visible in the text and visualize a feminine representation of such a stereotyped and idealized subject. Faithfulness to the text becomes here a perception of difference between which lays the ground for a reading and interpretation of Glenshie's works. The translator is visible in all the poems, and it is a visibility which enhances the poet's voice and her representation of what have always been considered as feminine themes, but from a woman's perspective. Thank you for listening. See you again in the 4th class. Bye bye.